All right, scaling the network. Now, I decided to make sure I included this with Lightning Network because for several reasons. One is that, again, the Lightning Network will get a lot of critique and you'll read about it. You'll be like, wait, oh my gosh. I mean, you'll read some of this stuff and you're like, geez, it makes it sound like the Lightning Network is going to break and explode at any moment, you know? The ironic thing is a lot of the criticism on the Lightning Network comes from other Lightning developers because in their world, that's healthy to critique and point out stuff because you want to provoke your coworkers, you know, and your, I want to say comrades, I'm sure that's right, but you want to provoke your community to continue to improve things, you know, and if you have a critique and no one's listening to you, hey, they'll just publish it on each other, not a big deal, you know. But it's also a real important piece because I really want to show people how basically the Bitcoin future, because Lightning is building the current state. Well, what is it going to look like in the future? What can we possibly do in the future that will be so much better, so much greater, you know? So regarding scaling, so right now you have the Bitcoin network. And then again, this is your Lightning channel. Remember, it's a multi-sig. One person, Alice, puts in her 0.5 Bitcoin, you know, and then you have the commitment, which now has it on that side. If I draw it like this is kind of how the Lightning Network works. You know, it's the commitment transaction, the funding transaction is anchored into Bitcoin. And then you're able to do all these transactions by clearing it. Oh, you want to buy some more? Oh, you know, so gray means it's gray is my analogy for ripping up the check. You know, you can keep ripping up the check and updating your balance. And you're able to do all these transactions without filling up the blockchain network, you know. So Bitcoin loves this because A, you can do things quickly, but B, you decrease traffic, you know, like you could be doing hundreds of transactions with one Lightning channel that never have to show up on the actual Bitcoin network. All that shows up on the Bitcoin network is one transaction when you started. And of course, anytime you want to cash out, one transaction when you decide to close your channels, you know. And eventually you're going to have to close out because the way the Lightning channel works is eventually you're going to run out of liquidity, right? All the liquidity is going to be on the other side. Now, in theory, you can keep it open if you're receiving funds, you know, but that's all relative on, I mean, look, if you're in your teens or your 20s, that'll probably work for you, you know, because these youngins, you know, they're always swapping money, you know, here, I'll pay you my share. You know, you go out to eat and everyone cash apps and Venmos and sends the tip all digital to someone else who pays it in cash. This is going to work perfect for them. For someone like that, they can stay on the Lightning Network like this, like forever. Because as long as they receive funds, send funds, receive funds, send funds. It's kind of like having a wallet where as long as people are giving you money, then you can spend the money, and then you receive money, and you can spend the money. For those of you who are older like us, we don't do stuff like that. You know, one of us pays for dinner, all right? And the next time someone else will pay for dinner. We don't split it up 8 ways and do it digitally. That's just weird, you know, but you kind of get my drift where if you run out of liquidity, then you could just open another payment channel and move on from there. But with that, we run into a major scaling issue, so to speak. So here we have the Lightning Network. So the question is, how can Lightning scale for worldwide adoption? Because we're all talking about Bitcoin's the money of the future, you know, and we already decided Bitcoin, as the most part, doesn't really work well for money, but Lightning is the money of the future. But when we think about onboarding, let's say 6 billion people, like we're approaching like 8 billion, but let's do 6 billion, you know, which is most of the first and second world countries and the majority of people in third world countries. We're not going to get every single person on earth, you know, to use it. Let's say 6 billion. Lightning scales vertically very easy as far as on, off, on, off, on, off. But what about actual being able to onboard people? You know, if you already have a Bitcoin address, it's a lot easier to get on Lightning. But if you don't, you know, you have to get some Bitcoin and then open a payment channel. Now, there are all these third-party services like Strike and Moon Wallet, and they're doing everything for you. Like if you go to the Strike app, I just go to deposit and, you know, I can just deposit funds, ACH transfer, and then I can immediately send you a Lightning payment. Now, how did I send you a Lightning payment? I don't even remember opening a Lightning channel. Well, in the simplest terms, it's they sent it over their Lightning network. You know, Strike has nodes that branch out to hundreds of thousands of people, you know, so going through them, they use the Lightning network as like payment rails, you know, and that's how they frame it. And that's great. And that's wonderful. The problem with that is you can always run into, it becomes too centralized, you know, if everyone's relying on some big company like Strike and let's say PayPal and Venmo create Lightning nodes, and all the traffic is going through these three, then what can they also do? They can censor, they can shut it down, they can do stuff that you don't want them to do. So by all intents and purposes, right now we're kind of like in a hybrid model where we have these big players who are making tons of connections, but we're also having tens of thousands of people do things the right way. Open it with payment channels, you know, like Leonore or anyone watching this video. If you want to open a payment channel with me, we can do that. Like, you know me. I mean, even if you don't know me, it's like, you know what, maybe I trust the guy I saw on YouTube, you know, or saw in that video that I paid for a class. I trust him more than a complete stranger. We can open payment channels with each other, you know, and we know that we don't have to trust each other because it's trustless. But we also know that we're increasing our probability of being able to send payments seamlessly through the network. So what's the problem? This is usually how you see it. So I'm going to show you the crazy math argument. And the argument goes like this. The blockchain processes about 144 blocks a day, right? On average, you see about 2,000 transactions per block. That really is the average currently right now. Maybe it's around like 2,100. So if you do the math, that's about 288,000 transactions per day. All right. Let's say hypothetically that you were to only use the Bitcoin network just to onboard people onto the Lightning network, all right? Something has happened. The world government has collapsed. Everyone has lost trust in all their money at one time, all right? So this is our goal. The goal is to get everyone in the world onto the Lightning network, all right? We're in a mad dash right now. How can we do that? Well, we can onboard 288,000 transactions a day. Well, it takes about 4 transactions really, because remember, when you have a Lightning channel, you got 1 transaction to open, 1 to get on, 1 transaction for the other person, and then you got 1 transaction to get off. So it's like 4 transactions per person in total. So if we divide that out by 4, we're looking at overall, you know, projecting the history, 72,000 people per day. That doesn't sound too bad. Well, when you divide it out by 6 billion, we're looking at it taking 83,333 days, which is about 228.15 years. Okay, so you will hear stuff like this. And to be honest, there is a valid problem, you know. The problem is the numbers don't quite mesh well, you know. First of all, the 2,000 transactions per block is on average, okay? Like, if we're gonna do this theoretical, you know, thing, why don't we go with the maximum, you know? Like, I think in the last couple months, the maximum block was, why isn't my, oh, this, oh, I forgot I animated this. I was like, oh, here I show when you have a Lightning channel, you know, you have 1 for the person to get on and he's pays in. You have another channel gets in here, and then you have 1 to get off. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where you get this divided by 4 math. All right. So now let's get real. All right, let's not do FUD. And why isn't my thing working? Oh, in reality, remember, this person, they don't need a transaction to get on. Remember, they're just sharing a public key. You know, the person that actually is funding the transaction, they're the one that needs to have a Bitcoin transaction on the network. And as far as getting off, like, look, we're talking about the theoretical best case scenario. Let's talk about a 20-year-old who may never have to get off the Lightning Network. They're always going to pay people back and forth, So let's take that back down to like 2 transactions. And in addition, instead of doing the 2,000 transactions per block, because remember, it varies, you can have full blocks out there that have 600 transactions. And then you can have full blocks that have up to 5,000 transactions is what the ones I've seen lately. It all depends on what kind of transactions they're using. A lot of people still aren't using SegWit, which is the upgrade from 4 years ago, let alone Taproot, but we're doing best case scenario. All right. So if we're doing best case scenario, I'm going to do 5,000 transactions a block. All right. So at that rate, we're looking at 720,000 transactions per day, which if you divide it out by 2, that means we can onboard 360,000 people per day. That means it's only going to take 45 years. Okay. We still have a problem, and it would seem that the problem is Bitcoin's just too slow. I mean, if you can only get 720,000 transactions per day, if you use every single transaction on the block for every single day, we have to find another solution. And that's basically what I'm saying. There has to be another solution. And I'm about to show you that solution. And that's most likely what I see as being the next upgrade. The next upgrade that Bitcoin will partake probably in another 2 to 3 years, because they're just starting to talk about it now, and they have to debate and they have to program it, and then they got to test it for several years, will be an upgrade called SIG hash any prev out, which is, who knows what they'll finally call it, but it's going to enable a lot of stuff. But one of the things it's going to enable is something called channel factories, which sounds kind of funny, like a channel factory. Like, what are you talking about? Let me show you how it works, and you're going to see how cool it is. All right. So imagine instead of onboarding, 2 people onto the Lightning Network, where only one person has spending power, the other person has receiving power, we get 4 people. All right. But this time, all 4 people could bring on liquidity. All right. So in here I did blue, he's putting in 0.65, red is 1, purple's 0.2, and yellow's 0.46. Now, they're not even on the Lightning Network yet. There's some other transaction. We don't quite know what this transaction is yet. This transaction is called the allocation transaction. And then this transaction is what they call the hook. Well, what do? Well, suffice, the allocation transaction allocates. So what you could do is let's say red and yellow want to open a payment channel together. This is a payment channel on the Lightning Network, and it's dual funded. So they each have liquidity on their side, which means on the outset, yellow could send payments or red could send payments. But not only that, you can see here, they didn't use their whole balance that they hooked in on the Bitcoin network. They only used a piece of it. Now, why would you do that? Well, you would do that because what if you could allocate more and more and more and more? You can allocate from this transaction 6 Lightning channels, where each participant has at least not one, let's look up red, not 1, but 2, but 3 channels. I mean, this is huge. First, because like I said, you want to have multiple channels. I mean, ideally, you probably want to have at least 6, right? But we just talked about how it's problematic that Bitcoin can't handle all these transactions, So now we see with 1 transaction, red can get 3 payment channels. Everyone gets 3, everyone has 3 with every combination. And not only that, but they can allocate whatever they want. And in this example, I gave everyone a balance, but let's say red was just concerned about sending funds. He was never concerned about receiving funds. Well, he could easily allocate a heavier balance all to make sure that he can always send out, or he doesn't care about receiving. But here we see we have a massive multiplication because we're able to create 6 lightning channels, all from one transaction. Now, this transaction, again, it's a lot like a lightning transaction in that it's a Bitcoin transaction. It's filled with logic inside. If we were to break it apart, we'd be able to analyze the logic. But it's kind of like a layer in between. Now, I wouldn't call this a layer 0.5. I'm not sure if this is layer 1 and this is 0. What is this, 0.5, you know? Because it's not so much that this is a layer. You know, this is really just using the logic. If anything, the Lightning network or your Lightning wallet would handle this, so to speak. But there's more. There's more to these channel factories than meets the eye. Let's say, let's take Red, for example. Oh, sorry. Also, I have to note that if someone wants to cash out, or if everyone wants to cash out, they can. It works just like before. You can cash out in just one 4-person transaction. Why isn't my pointer working here? Hello? All right, there we go. So let's take this transaction, for example. Let's just follow it through because Red's making payments. So Red makes a payment, right? We invalidate, we rip up that check, and they have a new balance, 0.2 and 0.35, because we added it over here, you know? And then we do another transaction. Okay, now, shoot, Red's out of funds, you know? Now, normally on Lightning, what happens? If you are out of balance, you have to open up another payment channel. Sorry, my brain. You have to open up another payment channel. You know, now we call it rebalancing. You know, I need to rebalance my node. Well, it's essentially opening up another payment channel and, you know, divvying up the allocation that way. Well, channel factories can do something extra cool. Well, Red is out on this channel, right? But he still has funds here and he still has funds here. And all of these are being controlled by this allocation transaction. So just how you can rip up the checks and move to another state for a payment channel, we can do the same thing with an allocation. So we can literally tear that up, reallocate everyone's funds across all the channels. So whatever remaining balance Red had left, he can now re-spread out over 3 channels, or maybe just put it over 2 channels, whatever he wanted. We have this massive flexibility where we can reallocate liquidity without doing any transactions on the Bitcoin network, which again is a huge plus because managing liquidity would be a major problem in this scenario because the goal is we want to onboard 6 billion people. All right. So the only way we're going to be able to do that is assuming that our 1 megabyte limit is still in place and Bitcoin is exactly sticking with its parameters. We need to maximize our transaction space. So here we're seeing a major maximization of transaction space because one transaction is able to do multiple channels. And on top of that, it can reallocate all those channels with just a simple offline transaction. And then lastly is, what if one of these people goes offline? Now, we didn't talk about this during Lightning, but if I have a payment channel with you, Lenore, and your node goes offline, I can't spend. I cannot spend. You know, the only thing I can do is I can cash out, you know, and you saw the mechanism where I can get all my money back, but what if I don't want to get all my money back? You know, I don't want to pay the extra fees, on-chain fees. I just want to keep my Lightning channel open. Well, that problem could seemingly be majorly exacerbated because if Red goes offline, is he going to take everyone offline? Like including the people that aren't even Red? Like, because that would be sucky. Well, it's not. So if Red goes offline, right, that means yellow is screwed here, blue is screwed here, and purple screwed here. But they're not really screwed like permanently because purple still has channels here and yellow still has channels. They all still have channels, you know? And remember, in most scenarios, when a channel goes offline, it's temporary. right? Because people's internet goes in and out, there's people that are running these wallets on their phone. So obviously if their phone dies or they swipe up and close the app, their channel is going to go offline, but they generally will put it back online as soon as possible. So note that a channel going offline isn't the end of the world. That's important. But in this scenario, if Red went offline, what could we do? We could take all the people that don't have a channel with Red, and we can create a brand new hook transaction. So all the guys that didn't have a transaction with Red, they can create a new transaction and a new allocation. Basically, they can do what's called splicing. They can splice Red out and they can continue on with a new allocation. Now, why is that important? Because if Red goes offline, remember, these guys can continue spending just fine, right? But what happens if yellow and blue, they get to a state where blue is out of liquidity? He can't reallocate, because in order to reallocate, they need Red. Red is MIA. So this gives them an option like, you know what? No, we can still reallocate. We're going to create a new hook transaction that's linked to the previous allocation transaction. That's going to create a newer allocation. And now we can continue on re-divvying up our liquidity by splicing Red out. So once again, it's just another very powerful mechanism in order to continue on, because when you have a larger group of people, you want to make sure you have caveats for when people disappear, if someone tries to act bad. And so this is, I hope you can see, this is a very powerful mechanism. And then it gets better, because why do it with just 4 people when you could do it with 20 people? So if you do this with 20 people, what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. You still have a hook transaction, right? But then we can actually have it structured where this actually will remain exactly the same, because this 20, we can allocate on layer 1 allocation, we can allocate it out to 4. And that 4 will be allocated into all of this. And from that allocation, we can do, obviously, because we got 20 people, we can split it out into a whole bunch of groups of 4, like 15 groups. In the end, with this 20-person hook, we can create 100 channels, all right? Essentially, all 20 people can get at least, 5 channels apiece with every permutation. And with that, they have the ability to, when they run out of liquidity, to reallocate, to refund their channels. If obviously, if you have a big group of 20 people, what if 1 or 2 of them goes offline? We can still splice them out and move forward. And we can do that all with minimum Bitcoin, main Bitcoin network interaction. Any questions on that? I know it's a big topic.
My big aha is how scalable it is. And I was wondering if there's a max of transaction channels allowed in each allocation, and how deep can it go? Because I know you're creating hooks and then allocations. Is there a max, or is it just continue? And then I think you answered the one about how many transactions or channels can a person have? I think you said
Correct.
five maybe.
Yeah, it's just like by 5.
5 channels. I'm sorry, 5 channels a person.
Well, since this hasn't been implemented yet,
Pretty interesting though.
All the literature, basically, according to the paper, is there really is no limits, Now, Christian Decker, who's the one who authored the original paper, suggested 20 as a maximum, but he didn't say it was the maximum. He was acknowledging that the more you have, it's probably become too increasingly complex, or complex to the point where, because obviously the more people you have, the higher the probability is that someone will go offline, because in an ideal situation, you'd be with 20 people, that's perfect. Because then if someone, if Bob goes offline, I call Bob, like, hey, Bob, what's going on? Oh man, my Wi-Fi, blah, 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 But when you're dealing with strangers, so 20 is kind of like this mathematical kind of sweet spot, as far as the max 100 channels, again, it's the same thing, and even in the original paper, I recreated the same exact drawings that he had in his paper, and I've modified them and made them, kind of my own, but he equally suggested that you would have one or two allocation layers like this, where you take 20 and then split it out into 5s or 4s. In this case, I did 4s. And then from those 4s, you can then split out into all your payment channels of 2.
And you're basically, I mean, what I'm seeing here is an organization in the system so that,
yeah.
And you're right, as you grow, it could get super complicated. So,
and again, the beauty of all this is all of these are secure, so to speak, because they have this smart contract state that makes it where people can be confident because it's anchored in Bitcoin. Now, the Lightning Network was perfect because it was a more simple example. Like all we needed was, a 202 multi-sig, and then another case where it was a time lock. And that was enough. And even that, you saw how you didn't really get a real glimpse, but it can get very complicated just with that. With this, of course, it ups the complexity. And this is only possible if we do a hard fork, and sorry, not a hot fork, a soft fork. And this would be the next Taproot like update, because there's a procedural low level ability that we need in order to do this. But you would see how it's very important to try to accomplish something like this, because here's the other thing is there's still another problem here. I don't know if you see it. Some of you may have noticed it. And the problem is this. This is great. 20 people, right? But remember, we're talking about onboarding people, all right? So these are people that do not have any Bitcoin and do not have any Lightning. So how are the 20 people going to do this? All 20 people are going to have to get some Bitcoin, right? That's 20 transactions. And then we have a hook transaction. So previously, before channel factories, it was 2 transactions per person, which meant to onboard 40 people, we needed what? 20 transactions. Correct? Yes. Wait, no, that's not right. Yeah, 2 transactions per person, right? Now we've taken that down to 1, but we still haven't solved the fundamental issue is we still need 20 transactions to get the people on, because each one of these little dots needs to be fed in by a Bitcoin transaction. So how are we going to deal with that? Turns out there's a really straightforward solution to that as well. And that is, one transaction can onboard 20 people, same size as a 1-to-1. Oh, that's another thing, because size, a lot of people are like, transactions, the bigger they get, they use up more space. But with Taproots or Schnorr signatures, which we'll go over next, a 20 to 20 multi-sig is the same exact size and bytes as a 1-to-1. That's what makes it so remarkable. And I'll discuss that next, how we're able to do that. But this Taproot's already out, Schnorr signatures are already out. So channel factories will use Schnorr signatures, That's why it says that overall you're getting a 96% blockchain savings, because if you were to do this the old-fashioned way, it would take 96% more blockchain transactions to do what this one transaction can do. So that's massive, and that's because of Schnorr signatures. So consider this. We just have to step back again and let's look at the Lightning transaction again, because that's an easy example. All right. Lightning transaction, 2 in, and 2 out. Bob puts in 0.5, Alice does her key, so there's the funding transaction. This is the one on the blockchain network. And there's the commitment transaction. This is the transaction that's floating out there that we don't have to send to the blockchain network because we can trust that we can cash that check, so to speak. So Bob's new, right? And Bob has no Bitcoin. He's got to get Bitcoin, right? So he's got to get some Bitcoin onto the network. Well, how would he likely do that? Well, he'd probably do it. Well, first of all, this picture is kind of deceiving because in reality, Bob has a block on the blockchain with an address, and he's the one funding, and he's funding a multi-signature address, right? So it's really him. Bob is the input. Alice, all Alice did was give her public key, and Bob took her public key and his public key, and he created the address, right? Which is what Bob sent to. So this is a more kind of realistic picture in this particular scenario. This is basically atomic swap. You may have heard of what atomic swaps are called, but atomic swap is when you can trade with someone, do a transaction with someone in such a way that it's trustless, that at any point during the process, no one could cheat, no one can run away with your funds. That's what's happening on the Lightning Network all the time. There are atomic swaps where you don't have to trust in anyone, because we don't want to have to trust in anyone. That's the whole point of a decentralized blockchain. So let's say Bob goes to Coinbase, right? Bob's new. He's one of the 6 billion people we're trying to get on board. Bob goes to Coinbase. What does he do? Bob, when you go to an exchange to get Bitcoin, what are you essentially doing? You're doing a swap. Now, it's not an atomic swap because it doesn't need to be trustless. We can trust in Coinbase. When Coinbase takes $100 out of my account because I'm buying Bitcoin, I don't worry that Coinbase is going to run off with my funds. Why? Because they're secured by the government, KYC, they're a company. Like, if they try to steal from me, I have recourse, I have legal action, So we're doing the swap with Coinbase. So if Bob buys $100, he gives $100 to Coinbase, and Coinbase does what? They send the funds to a address that Bob controls. Well, what would happen if we just cut out the middleman? What if Bob and Alice worked with Coinbase? I mean, they can trust Coinbase, right? So Alice gives her public key to Bob. Bob combines them, makes a multi-signature address. He gives $100 to Coinbase and says, send it to this address, this multi-signature address. Coinbase does it. What have we just done? We have onboarded Bob onto the Lightning transaction, onto the Lightning network, so to speak, with not two, with just one. You don't need two. Like, you don't have to. Now, granted, if you want to do everything trustless and outside the purview of any centralized government, yes, you need two. You got to find a way to get on the network, and then you could work trustlessly with someone. But that's not the situation we're in. We're in a scaling situation, all right? Coinbase, we can trust to convert funds to Bitcoin anyways. So we can trust an exchange to go ahead and do this. The exchange can help onboard us. And remember, what does Coinbase even know? Coinbase doesn't even know Alice's public key or Bob's public key, because we just gave it the address, which is a hash of that information. So that information is still private. Coinbase, if the government gets on them, they can track that address to me, but Alice, she's not even trackable in that situation, So my point being is, what if we did that with the channel factory? Same situation. We now no longer need 20 people to do 20 transactions to all get some Bitcoin on the network. All 20 people could all be, in this example, Coinbase customers, and they all want to get on. Coinbase has 10,000 people they want to get on. How are they going to do it? Well, they're just going to grab them in groups. I'm going to grab this 20. All 20 of these people are going to ACH transfer their funds to Coinbase, right? Because they can all put different amounts. And all of these people all put their public keys together to create a giant 20 by 20 address. And Coinbase sent the funds to that one address. So now we have one transaction onboarded 20 people onto the Lightning Network. technically speaking, you could say that they're not even on the Bitcoin network. I mean, they are on the Bitcoin network, but they don't have the ability to send Bitcoin peer to peer. But in this theoretical situation, no one really cares. Everyone's trying to get on the Lightning Network because the Lightning Network is fast and it's everything. So everyone's trying to get on the Lightning Network. So with this simple procedure, we now truly did onboard 20 people in one transaction. Now, how does Coinbase pay out funds? They don't pay out to one address at a time. They pay out to hundreds, thousands. I just saw one this morning as I was doing some tests where I don't know what exchange it was, but they did all three in a row, 3 massive transactions, each one paying out to 1,500 people, because obviously there's a bunch of people doing trades, So now let's discuss, given the current state of the blockchain network, what really is the theoretical limit? It's certainly not 2,000 per block because that's an average, The max that I've seen by querying the data is 5,000, but that doesn't mean it's the theoretical maximum. So I had to bust out with my Bitcoin calculator, do some math, and to my surprise, I realized that if every person suddenly was using Taproot and they were doing one-to-one transactions, you could put 9,000 transactions into a block. Shoot, that's over a 4-fold increase, But once again, Coinbase isn't doing one-to-one, So the real question is, how many can you do one-to-many? You have to use Taproot because channel factories require Taproot. How many people can Coinbase pay using our existing 1 megabyte limit? 23,000. That is how many outputs you can have theoretically on a block right now if you constructed a Taproot transaction to pay out to addresses, 23,000. So what does that mean overall? That means the exchange can onboard either 23,000 people per block if you're doing regular Lightning Network. But what if every single one of these wasn't one person? It was 20 people. Currently, again, with our current limitations, you could onboard 23,000 channel factories per block. And remember, it's the same exact size, because we haven't discussed Schnorr signatures, but Schnorr allowed you to have a 20 by 20 signature just be the same size as a regular signature, So at 20 people per channel, that means we could do 460,000 people per block, which comes out 144 blocks a day. We can onboard 66.2 million people per day onto the blockchain. So if that's all we did, we could onboard everyone in the world in 90 days. Now, of course, we know that that's not really how it works, So if we take that 90 days and make it spread out, and let's say we only use 20% to onboard people and 80% to do regular day-to-day Bitcoin transactions and Lightning transactions, we could probably spread it out throughout the year and have a practical way of getting the whole world onboarded in a year, which is more than reasonable. Ta-da! Any questions?
I am just wowed by all
I
this
know.
technology.
It is pretty cool.
It is amazing.
And so, again, another reason why I wanted to share this isn't just to get you excited about what's coming up and to answer criticism about the Lightning Network. I mean, if anything, what you can take away from this is, A, that's really cool. But B, it's like, sometimes if you're not an engineer and you don't think like an engineer, it's so easy to run into problems and think like, oh, that's impossible. You see that all the time. You just can't do that. Because honestly, before I learned about these, even I thought that's not possible, But I still knew in my mind, like, you never know. They're always coming up with clever stuff, And sure enough, it's just the ingenuity. And it's just amazing how, and remember, this is just a potential possibility. The Bitcoin developers I've read on the message board, it's not even a big deal if they decide to double the block space to 2 MB or to 4. Like at this point, we're so past like the Bitcoin Cash and all that because network speeds and everything has gotten so much faster. That's not even a big deal. But remember our underlining premise, like don't do something if you don't have to. If you rewind the clock all the way back to the Bitcoin Cash days, the developers were still thinking like this. Like they didn't know this was possible back then, but they were all engineers and they were brilliant computer scientists. And they're like, look, first of all, don't come up with a solution to a problem that doesn't exist yet. The first fork in Bitcoin was like, it can't scale. And the developers were like, it's not even being used to 100%. Like, really? Like, it's one thing if it was maxed out and fees were like $100 and like, oh, like you're talking like we're always looking forward. That's what we're doing. You're trying to force it, and now I'm showing you technology based on the existing. This is how Bitcoin is right now, that we could possibly do something like this, that's just remarkable to me, Now, obviously, the skeptic may still come back and be like, "Oh, well, what happens when you offboard everyone and you still, yes, there's still stuff to that maybe isn't perfect, but it's like, look, I just gave you a solution to a seemingly impossible problem. Previously it was like it's going to take 250 years, and now we got it down to 90 days. That's really like the lesson to be learned here. All right, where am I at now? Oh, so now overall, we have a roadmap that looks like this. The Bitcoin, we got channel factories built on top of the Lightning Network. And then, of course, we got Taro. Taro is the next big thing, which we're going to go over in the Taro session, because that is so cool. Like if you thought it was cool how Lightning worked and you thought it was cool how you can scale it, Taro just makes it even cooler because they're like, wait, what? Okay, what? Now we can send stable coins and NFTs, and we can mint coins without having to create another block in a crap chain, and we can build it on top of Bitcoin, and it won't use up any space on the blockchain network. Like, how is that possible? Any questions? You get.
I'm good.